Welcome to the Deathcast.
He drives, his head on a constant swivel as he navigates these familiar streets. Daytona Beach, 1980. The man behind the wheel of the red gremlin knows where he's going. His sexual desires guiding him on. He sees a woman, her long, dark hair hanging about shoulder length, standing on the side of the road and pulls over. He doesn't miss a beat before asking her if she's working that night. The woman has seen and been with him before. In fact, all the girls working the strip have. He's what they call a regular. The woman, Donna Hensley, gets into the car and they head off to the hotel room where she lives. He makes small talk, casual. The man driving believes he is a ladies' man, and he's about to show her that. She can barely hear the words he says over the blaring beats of the disco music coming from the radio, and she wonders to herself briefly why anyone would listen to this type of music. Later, at the hotel, the sex is quick, ungratifying. He pays her, placing a $20 bill into her hand. Before beginning to get dressed, Donna Marie clutches the money tightly in one fist as she begins to get dressed. Then the man says something and she turns towards him. His demeanor has changed. The round cherubic face has grown cold, hard. The eyes behind the glasses glaring at her like pieces of flint. Then he lunges. She fights him, screaming as he stabs her first with a knife, then a pair of scissors, a bottle opener. Donna collapses to the floor, her head spinning wildly. Then the man's shadow falls across her, and she can vaguely see a bottle in his hand. The word acid printed on the label in dark black ink. She notices his face then. The cherubic look is gone, replaced by a dark rage that twists his looks into something inhuman and evil. Donna snaps back into reality, bolting upright and running from the door, screaming. The man stands there for a moment, as if lost in thought as to whether he should go after her or not. Then he takes off, running down to the gremlin and tearing off into the night. Donna makes it to the reception area of the hotel. She is screaming, blood running from her arms and half-covered chest. The receptionist is just barely able to make out her words, and an ambulance is called. It arrives not long afterwards, along with a police cruiser. A statement is taken, and then Donna heads to the hospital. Although frightened, she is thankful to have survived the night. Neither she nor the patrol officer who arrived to assess the situation have any idea how lucky Donna really was, for the man who attacked her was one of Florida's most prolific yet unknown serial killers. His name was Gerald Eugene Stano, and this is his story. Hello again, and welcome to episode number 5 of the Deathcast. I'm your host, best-selling independent author Ian Totten. Tonight we're going to be looking at the case of convicted serial killer Gerald Stano. Before we get into that, got our normal plugs. I'd like to thank everyone who's been supporting the Deathcast through listens and shares on social media and messaging me to give me their thoughts on the show. I really do appreciate your input. You can follow the show on Instagram and Twitter at Author Totten. That's AuthorTotten. If you'd like to support the Deathcast, I'm on Patreon at Ian Totten. You can also find me on Facebook at Ian Totten Author. There's a group link to that page that is specifically dedicated to this podcast. It's called the Deathcast Group. You want to join in? I should be off of my Facebook ban here in the next few days. And from everything I've seen, it looks like people are having a lot of fun. Now that my pandering is out of the way, let's go into the crypt. When we left our story a moment ago, Donna Marie Hensley had just been taken to the hospital. Her case was assigned to one Detective Jim Gadbury of the Daytona Beach Police Department. Not long after this incident, Gadbury received a tip from an informant letting him know where the man in the red car lived. Gadbury went to check it out, only to be informed that their suspect, Gerald Stano, no longer lived there. Gadbury used a crime computer to track him down through the red gremlin that he owned. Gadbury, who had learned from Hensley that Stano frequented prostitutes, especially those who operated along the beachfront, went and spoke with a number of them. He was described as kind of weird and spooky. One of the women that Gadbury spoke with said that Stano, with his thick, dark-rimmed glasses, frequently picked up prostitutes and female hitchhikers, and that several weeks beforehand he had picked her up as well. The woman, a 20-year-old named Donna Washington, said she and Stano had gone off and had sex, at which point he had paid her $20. When questioned further as to what happened, Washington then recounted a tale that was eerily similar to that of Hensley's. Stano had grown angry with her over some perceived slight and demanded his money back, which Washington initially refused. Stano then attacked her, throwing her from his car before screeching off into the night. Washington had decided not to press a police report, despite the fact that Stano had fired shots from her from the window of his car moments later. Another young woman recounted a similar case, wherein Stano had tried to strangle her to death. Somehow she had managed to escape, stating that after sex he had seemed to boil with rage. Gadbury looked further into Stano's background and discovered he had a prior record for writing bad checks. He pulled the file and passed the information along to another detective, Sergeant Paul Crow, informing him that his suspect had an issue with prostitutes. Crow kept the information to himself, while Gadbury continued with his investigation. He organized a photo lineup and brought Hensley in. She immediately identified Gerald Stano as the man who had attacked her in her hotel room. He was able to get an affidavit signed charging Stano with aggravated assault, after which he went to visit the man at his place of employment, a small restaurant where Stano worked as a short-order cook. It was April Fool's Day, 1980. Stano was quickly arrested, and while he was led out to the waiting paddy wagon, he protested his innocence. Back at the police station, Detective Paul Crow continued working on his murder investigation. On February 17th of that year, the body of Mary Carol Mayer had been found lying on its side, covered with branches. There was a stab wound to one of the legs, similar to the one Donna Hensley had received. Mayer, who was 20, had last been seen at the Holiday Inn Boardwalk on North Atlantic Avenue. There was a club at the top of the hotel that was popular with the area's youth. Mary Carroll was supposed to get a ride home with friends. Crow knew that Mayer had been a star swimmer in school, and he suspected that she may have gotten into the car with the person who had abducted her. Employees at the hotel thought they had seen her get into the elevator with a man who appeared to be Hispanic, although none of the tips they had received had yielded any leads. According to Crow, the first time he met Stano was that day at the police station on April 1st. Upon meeting the detective, Stano had blurted out that today was his birthday. Blurted out upon meeting the detective that today was his birthday. Both men had looked at him questioningly before Stano explained that he had been adopted. Crow related that his son was adopted as well. The three men made small talk before getting to the heart of the matter. Crow produced two pictures, one of Mary Carol Mayer and her sister, and handed them to their suspect, and asked if he knew either of them. After a moment, Stano announced that he didn't need no one of them, pointing out the picture of Mary Carol. He went on to explain that he had given her a ride on January 27, implying that she'd been out prostituting herself. After stopping to pick up beer, which Stano insisted she had wanted, he claimed to have let Mary Carol out of the car. Crow pushed the issue, pointing out that he didn't believe that Mary Carol had got out of his car, that instead he thought that maybe there had been an argument of some type. Eventually, Stano agreed, stating that he had hit her. After she began, quote, bitching real bad. After explaining that she had made him extremely mad, Stano said he reached under his seat and pulled out a knife before stabbing her in the chest. Mary Carol slumped over, and Stano continued his attack, all the while driving. Stano further went on to explain that Mary Carol Mayer had tried to get out of his car, and Stano had stabbed her in the leg, hooking her so that he could drag her back inside, at which point he continued his assault. For Crow, it was a small victory, as one of the facts of the case that had been held back from the public was that Mary Carol had a stab wound in her leg that was so forceful it broke her femur bone. They stopped the interview at that point while Gadbury went to get a tape recorder. Crow was pleased with himself. He had gotten his killer. The only question was, who exactly was Gerald Eugene Stano? Gerald Eugene Stano was born Paul Zieninger on September 12, 1951, in Schenectady, New York. His birth mother had neglected him to such an extent that she gave him up at 6 months old. Doctors at the time said the young baby was functioning at an animalistic level, even eating its own feces in order to survive. He was declared as unadoptable by the state, even after one of the nurses at the hospital where he was being taken care of, Norma Stano, and her husband, Eugene, decided to adopt him. Despite the court's protestations, they eventually did so. The Stanos have been described as a loving couple who showered the newest member of their family with love and affection, which they hoped would bring the quiet, reserved child out of his shell. 6 months later, after a court-ordered hearing, Stano was examined and found again to be adoptable. His adoptive parents, however, fought back tooth and nail and eventually won. It has been stated in numerous reports and articles that neither of the parents ever saw the psychiatrist's report that was done on the baby, and I was unable to find a copy of it online, which makes me curious as to what it actually says. Did this team of trained social workers and psychologists see something in the baby that gave them cause for alarm? Was Gerald's inhumanity present at such a young age? We may never know. What we do know is that Stano was an aloof child who'd never showed any affection towards his adoptive parents. He was an early walker, but clumsy, and did not begin to communicate fully until almost the age of 2. He was a bedwetter until the age of 10, and continued to sporadically eat his own feces. One thing the parents did note, though, was that he was a very neat child, to the point that he would throw temper tantrums if things were not kept exactly in their place. He was also a bully who pushed younger children around and taunted them. On top of that, Gerald was a known liar and a thief. School officials complained numerous times to the parents that something was seriously wrong with the boy, and nothing was done. Some of this can be attributed to the fact that Gerald was never able to fit in with his classmates. He always seemed to be apart from them no matter what it was that they were doing. He was not particularly good at school, earning C's and D's, although in music class he did excel. Around the 6th or 7th grade, he began to murder one of his neighbor's chickens, picking up the small chicks and twisting their necks until they sharply broke. Afterwards, he would watch and listen gleefully as the tiny animal died slowly in his hands. He revealed this years later while under hypnosis. Around this time, he also began to phone in false fire alarms to the fire department. People who witnessed these phone calls said that Gerald seemed to take extreme satisfaction and gain some sense of power from the calls, as fire trucks would be dispatched to put out the apparent blaze. He was also known to throw rocks and bricks off of overpasses onto passing cars, at one point smashing out the windshield of a car, although the driver was not hurt. As with the fire alarms, he was caught, and the Westchester County officials informed his parents that one more strike and he would have to go away to juvenile detention. The thought of one of their children being a juvenile delinquent apparently scared the Stanos, and they immediately removed him from school and sent him to the Hargrave Military Academy in Virginia. His time at military school was a harrowing one, as Gerald would borrow money from other cadets and refuse to pay it. This in turn led to them taunting him over his weight and his glasses, and even abusing him greatly. They removed him from the academy and sent him to Ormond Beach, Florida, where Norma's parents lived. Those who knew the family have stated that Gerald's grandparents were uneasy with the child around, and that by the time his parents came to retrieve him, they had installed locks on their bedroom doors. Again, another curious development, which, much like the original psychological evaluation, makes me wonder exactly what was going on that his grandparents saw, that they felt the need to put a lock on their bedroom door for when they were sleeping at night. Stano moved with his parents to Ambler, Pennsylvania, where he quickly got into trouble at school for giving money to other students in the hopes that they would run slower during gym class in order to make him look better, and thus impress his parents. Gerald continued on with his other antics, such as lying and cheating, and it began to take a toll on the family. He had a younger brother named Arthur, who eventually ran away from home in order to escape his brother. Eventually, Stano graduated from high school and went to the computer school at the Maxwell Institute. This too, like many things in his life, was short-lived, and Stano soon dropped out, taking a job at the Chestnut Hill Hospital, from which he was quickly fired after being caught stealing money from female employees. He was living on his own at this point in a rundown hotel, and Gerald went through a string of jobs that ended in abject failure, and he was eventually forced to return home. It was around this time that Stano began to drink heavily. He later described himself as an alcoholic. He also began to abuse drugs. It's unknown when Gerald Stano had his first sexual encounter, but it is known that shortly after he went to work for the Burroughs Corporation, he began to date a young mentally disabled woman named Yvonne, who became pregnant with his child. Gerald's family was forced to eventually pay for the abortion. Stano has been quoted as saying, "I was very picky at my girlfriends, like Yvonne up in Pennsylvania. If the young lady is a respectful type, I will take her and treat her with respect, but if she is a tramp, she won't get any respect from me." That term there, ladies, is one that Stano used time and time again to describe women, as well as when he would describe going out with a woman. It was never out on a date, or when he would pick them up, he saw her walking, and he was hoping that he could, quote, get a little sex. Stano comes off as a very sleazy, leisure suit type wearing individual who's only out for his own gratification, And, I mean, to look at him, it's kind of laughable because you see him wearing the shirts with the large lapels and then these gigantic Coke bottle glasses with this mess of hair on his head that is thinning so badly you can see the top of his skull. Now, after moving back in with his parents, it was decided he would accompany his mother back to Florida where she was taking care of her ailing parents. While there, he met Teresa Esposito, who was a 23-year-old hairdresser, and they eventually decided to get married. This was nearly derailed when Stano was arrested for forging checks, but eventually his in-laws-to-be stepped in and they were able to get the charges dismissed. After their wedding, Stano's father-in-law, Mario Esposito, gave his son-in-law a job at the service station he owned. His marriage, however, was short-lived, as was his employment. Stano began to beat his wife on more than one occasion in front of her own family, using his fists and a belt. At one point, he even assaulted her dog. Years later, when describing his marriage to a counselor, Stano stated that one of the major issues in their marriage was his wife's perceived laziness, as he, a self-confessed neat freak, wanted everything in its place, while she would do things such as leaving laundry to sit in the washing machine while she watched television. He would become so enraged during these times that he would leave the house and go and visit prostitutes. By the time that the divorce was finalized, Stano was 25 years old, and he was, according to his own admission, drinking 1 case of beer a week and 2 cases on the weekends. He'd begun smoking pot and taking downers. He stated that the disillusion of his marriage is what started him down the road to being a serial killer. Although later he would change this, claiming to have begun his killing spree in 1969 when he was 18, of which there is actual evidence to support this claim. Stano stated during his interrogations that he had killed 6 or 7 women while he lived in Pennsylvania, and it is known that he killed a number of women in New Jersey and the majority of his victims in Florida. Now, it's hard to get a real timeline of his life during the mid to late 70s. Stano moved around quite a bit and changed jobs quite often, usually being fired for stealing or showing insubordination to his superiors. Intermingled with all of this was his killing of both prostitutes and young women who were in need. In fact, Stano seemed to gravitate towards women who were having car trouble, as he himself was beyond being a car nut. He was obsessed with them, and every time that he gave a statement, he would go into great detail about what kind of car he was driving at the time, what it had, as far as, stereo system, motor, the type of tires he had on it. He really got into detail about that before he would delve into the killing. And while Stano confessed to well over 80 murders, 40 of them have been confirmed, and I'm not going to get into all of them, but there are a few key ones I am going to hone in on and talk about. First, this message. Authors and small business owners, are you looking for an inexpensive, effective way to promote your business and get new customers? Promoting on a podcast such as this one will introduce your product to hundreds of new potential customers on a daily basis. I can tell you from my own experience, having done it, that promoting through a podcast is the best investment I ever made. My last 2 books, The Throwaway Girls of Olympia and The House of Silver Doors, were both promoted on the Breaking Kayfabe with Bowdrin and Barry podcast, and I saw immediate results, with sales nearly doubling overnight. Now, I know what you're thinking, promoting on a podcast has to be expensive. Well, that's not true. If you contact me at authoriantotten@gmail.com, that's authoriantotten@gmail.com, I promise you I will give you the best deal on podcast advertising going today. I can tell you from trying to run ads on other shows, you can end up spending it from $5 to over $1,000 a placement. But if you contact me today at authoriantotten@gmail.com, I'm going to give you 2 weeks for the price of one, and it's not even going to cost you a fraction of that. Now, the best part about placing an ad on a podcast is there's no shelf life to that ad, unlike a place like Facebook where you have to put an end to your ad campaign. I'm not going to go back through and re-edit the podcast to remove your ad, so it's going to be there permanently. So contact me at authoriantotten@gmail.com and expand your business today. Now, back to our story. In a letter from November 3rd, 1985, Gerald Stano wrote to reporter Kathy Kelly, "I thought I would never get caught and everything would be all right. But it didn't work out that way at all." While he was incarcerated, Gerald Eugene Stano underwent a number of psychological evaluations, one of which was done by a Dr. McMillan, who concluded that Stano had never been a normal personality, nor had he ever had a pattern of normal male-female relationships. He had a number of reasons why he killed and killed again. He stated that being lonely in his apartment and seeing all the young couples out having fun would enrage him, and then he would go out in his car and find a girl walking. The quote, young lady would then do something to enrage Stano, which would set him off and begin the cycle of killing. And looking at his relationships with women, it's interesting to see that none of the women he had a serious relationship would be what anybody could call normal. His first girlfriend was mentally disabled, the second was an epileptic and had undergone brain surgery, while his third girlfriend was a runaway who purportedly had behavioral problems. His only other major relationship was with his ex-wife, whom Stano described as having emotional problems. I think you can see a pattern here. It's that he's going after women who are broken in some way, and when I say that, I don't mean to be disrespectful in any way, shape, or form to those women, but each of them had some defect that he was able to exploit, and he carried that over into his killing because Stano had a knack for finding the most vulnerable among society and then bending them to his will through murder. Now we're going to look at a few of Stano's other victims, one of whom was Nancy Hurd, who moved to Florida in 1974 as part of a way to figure out her path in life. She was married to a man named Tom, who was a radar technician in the Air Force, and he was attempting to get himself discharged in order that he could go back to school and finish his degree. Nancy has been described as perky looking with wavy blonde hair. She was 24 years old and she worked as a maid at the Mandarin Motel in Ormond Beach. Nancy was working this job on January 2nd, 1975, when she walked from the motel down to the beach and encountered Gerald Stano. Her body was found a few hours later by Charles Austin Hill IV and a friend near the dirt extension of Old Dixie Highway north of Below Creek Road near Tomoko State Park. She was lying beneath power lines, her body covered with branches. In a written statement dated March 6, 1981, Stano said, "I remember taking a girl up there with me, Below Creek, with a blue purse trimmed in brown and light-colored clothes. During our travel, we got into an argument, and I hit her in the head with the back of my hand. She said she wanted to go back to the beach, and I said, 'Shut up, bitch,' and I hit her again. We then stopped along some little path, and I began to move towards her, and she was nervous. Then I put my hands up to her, and I strangled her." There has been some speculation in recent years that Stano might not have actually committed this murder, but if you look at his statements that he gave, he described the area as well as the body, how he left it, what it was wearing, in almost crystal clear detail. Another one of his victims was Susan Basil, who had moved to Florida from Ohio in the fall of 1975. She was a cosmetologist who had moved there in an attempt to find a better paying job. Instead, she ended up working a waitress job, which sadly she was only able to keep for 5 weeks. On December 20th, 1975, 2 fishermen found a body floating in the water underneath the East Bridge on Spruce Creek on I-95. Susan was reported missing not long after that by her roommate, who came in on December 31st and gave a brief description of her. Almost 7 years later, on August 18, 1982, Gerald Stano admitted to her murder. This one is actually kind of questionable, as if you look at Stano's statements given to Detective Paul Crow, it's obvious that the detective is actually leading him with his questions. And the reason I'm bringing this up is there are a number of murders that Stano is suspected of having committed, where it is believed that Crow fed him information beforehand and then had Stano parrot it back to him afterwards. I should note, however, that Stano did in fact commit murders and was actually a serial killer. There's just a lot of doubt as to whether he had killed all of the people that he said he did. Now, according to Stano, he met Susan as she came out of her job at PJ's and convinced her to get into the car with him. Again, they went for a drive, and she upset him, so he began to hit her, before eventually choking her. When questioned about what Stano had done with the body, he replied, "Not exactly in the water. There was like a little bit of what you call it? A sandy area, a beach area, like a little miniature beach. I put her down." Crow said, "Gerald, I'm confused about this. You didn't put her on the beach and put her in the water?" "Somewhere around the water's edge," Stano replied. There's some more back and forth between the two men, and it becomes pretty obvious that Crow is trying to get Stano to say that he placed the body in the water. At any rate, whether he did it or not, Stano was convicted of this crime in 1983 and sentenced to death for it. One of the mitigating factors being the fact that Susan had a prolonged death, as Stano hadn't actually killed her. He'd only knocked her unconscious by strangling her, and she actually died from drowning as they found seawater and sand inside of her lungs. September 6, 1973 was a typical day for twins Barbara and her brother Bert Bauer. The two 17-year-olds were hanging out at their house when Barbara decided she wanted to go over to the mall and get some fabric in order to make her cheerleading outfit. When she had not returned after a few hours, the family became concerned, especially after checking with Barbara's friends and learning that she had not spoken to any of them beyond letting them know that she planned on going to the mall that day and picking up fabric for her outfit. As discussed in the Houston mass murders, police departments in the 1970s and before then operated under a much different set of rules. When teenagers were reported as missing, they more times than not informed the parents that their child was probably a runaway and that they needed to wait in order to see if they came home. And this was the case with Barbara Ann. When her parents called to inform them that their daughter was missing, they were told that she probably took off and they needed to wait at least 2 days before reporting her as missing. This despite Barbara's mother, Audrey's, protestations that her daughter would never have run away. When they did finally take the matter seriously, a missing persons report was filed and a search was begun. Nothing was learned of the young woman's fate, until April 10th, 1974. At around noon, Jimmy Green, a jailer on duty at the Bradford County Jail, received a telephone call from Lily Browning, who lived just east of South Road. The woman said that her husband had found what it appeared to be a human skull near their home in a wooded area. The jailer then alerted a deputy, who in turn alerted the sheriff. They located the skull, and then later, the skeleton of a human body lying beneath a large tree branch. There was a rope tied around the rib cage. They also recovered 1 sandal, 3 rings, a locket and a chain, 1 gold earring, 1 pair of shorts, and a shirt. Back at the Browning household, they asked the couple if they had heard anything, and were told, before they closed the dump road, "Me and my husband would often hear yelling, screaming, and carrying on in the vicinity of where they found the skeleton. Some hippie-type young people go to that area at night to party." Upon further recollection, she and her husband had heard a woman scream, "Don't hit me no more, don't do it anymore." Mr. Browning had been prepared to go investigate, but was dissuaded in doing so by his wife. A few days later, after some denial, Barbara Ann's mother finally admitted that the items belonged to her daughter, and the body was identified. 5 months after that, on September 30th, a patrolman from Valdosta, Georgia, called the Daytona Police Department, called and reported that they had found Barbara Ann's vehicle abandoned behind a motel on Interstate 75. This is an interesting one, as it's the only crime that Stano has claimed that he actually moved the victim's vehicle, as well as claiming that he initially had an accomplice in the murder. This was something he later retracted. Again, though, this was a first for Stano, because so far as detectives knew, he had always acted alone. Stano claimed that at the time of the murder, he was on vacation at a hotel which was owned by the parents of a high school friend of his. He said that the two of them had gone out that afternoon to cruise for women and hopefully get laid. When coming through a parking lot, they'd seen a car parked with its hood up, the exact same type of car Stano himself was driving at the time. According to Stano, they'd pulled over to help the young woman and discovered she had a dead battery. Stano helped her jumpstart a car and then said that they had better drive it around for a little while to make sure that the battery would stay charged. Stano informed her that he would replace any gas that he used in driving, and the girl readily agreed. They drove for a while before stopping at a gas station, at which point Stano's friend said that he believed the girl would be willing to have sex with them if they drove around for a little while longer, and Stano continued driving. At some point, Barbara Ann Bauer became concerned, and according to Stano, he hit her for the first time in full view of his friend, who was following them in his own car. They continued driving, and again he hit her before they pulled off onto a side road. Eventually he pulled over and made his intentions known to Barbara, who naturally began to panic. Stano then said he began to tie the young woman up and hit her while his friend looked on. Now, upon initially reading this part of the story, I was skeptical because I can't imagine his friend who he had known from high school would just be completely cool and nonchalant about the fact that his friend was assaulting a young woman in front of him and tying her up. But that's what Stano claimed. He then said they removed her from his car and drove further down this road, at which point they pulled over and Stano strangled her without provocation. Afterwards, Stano placed her on her side and covered her with leaves and other debris, as he had done with his other victims, before the two men backtracked and picked up Barbara Ann's car. They then drove to Georgia and left the car, where it was later found. He had left Florida for Pennsylvania the next day, and his friend never brought it back up to him. Later, Stano's friend had been arrested for this crime, after which Stano exonerated him by claiming he was the only one present during the murder, and that he had not actually been friends with the young man and had simply implicated him as a way to get back to him for the taunting and teasing he had suffered at his hands while in school. To this day, detectives who interrogated Stano do believe that another individual was involved in the murder, although they do not believe it was Stano's friend. No other suspect has ever been named. The last case we're going to look at is, for me, the worst of Stano's crimes. And it's the one that I remember the most, because when I originally read his story, back when I was in the Navy, I had a friend who was from Florida who had looked exactly like this girl. So much so that, in fact, that when I showed her a picture of the young woman he had killed, she freaked out and began showing it to other people. They were spitting image twins of each other, which was a really freaky coincidence. This young lady is Stano's youngest known victim, 12-year-old Susan Basil. This is the only case that Stano confessed to that he refused to speak about afterwards. The reason it's believed he would not talk about it is because he actually knew this young woman. Susan Basil would go to a local skating rink where Stano said he volunteered kind of as a chaperone, and that the two of them would skate together during couples skates. Now, initially, Stano stated he only had picked her up that afternoon and dropped her off, after which he had never seen her again, but detectives weren't buying that. Susan Basil was the youngest child in her family, and according to her brother, she was pretty much everybody's baby. She was, the apple of her older brother's eye. Her parents absolutely adored her. And when she disappeared on June 10th, 1975, it absolutely devastated them. Susan had just gotten off the bus from school and was about a quarter mile from her house when she simply vanished. Her parents found it odd when she did not return home, and 2 hours after she should have been there, they went to the police department and reported her as missing. This sent off a massive manhunt that grew to include the use of helicopters as well as NASA technicians helping to locate the young woman. A local neighborhood child eventually came forward and said he had seen Susan as she walked towards a blue Chevy van with white writing on the side. They even went so far as to recreate that fateful afternoon, but were unable to learn the location of Susan. One of the things that led police to suspect Stano after he was in custody was the fact that he continuously talked about the skating rink long before they ever brought up the name of Susan Basil. Now, I'm going to post pictures of Susan on my Instagram page. The reason for this is there is still some speculation as to whether or not she was actually a victim of his. But for the purpose of this podcast at the moment, we're going to operate under the assumption that she was. I'm going to read Stano's statement at this time. I, Gerald Eugene Stano, age 31, date 10/1/82, do hereby make this statement upon my own will and accord. On about June 1975 in the afternoon, I was driving down Herbert Street in a 1973 Plymouth Satellite Custom, 4-door and green over green, when I approached a young girl walking down the side of the road. She was wearing jean-tight pants and a blouse and was carrying school books with a purse of some sort. She got into my car with no force of any sort from me. She recognized me from Starlight Skate Centers on Nova Road, South Daytona, because I used to assist the floor guards there. The young lady broke her arm once, I remember, because I think I helped her to the office where Glenn, owner's son-in-law, took over the situation. I was a very good skater along with her. I believe we used to skate together during couples and all skate. In the car, the conversation was about skating. The young lady thought we were going to the skating rink, but I turned south on Nova Road, going towards Port Orange. At one time, just after turning on Nova Road, she started to try and get out of the car. I reached over and hit her at that time with the back of my right hand, which carries my class ring. At that point, I was just before the railroad tracks on Nova, where I turned off on a dirt road to the right. Then I reached over to her and pulled her to me by the hair. With both my hands around her neck, I strangled her at that time. After that, I got out of the driver's seat of the car and went around to the passenger side and opened the door. Reaching with one hand to hold her head, I pulled her out of the car and put her by some trees and covered her over with some twigs and branches. I can't remember to this day where the body is or what happened after I covered her over. All I remember is leaving and going back to my trailer on Hull Road. I was working for Mario Esposito at the time on US 1 and Granada Boulevard, Ormond Beach, Florida, and that day I was drinking very heavily due to an argument we had at the station. Gerald Eugene Stano, October 1st, 1982. Later, Stano retracted his confession to Susan Basil's murder, claiming he had been on probation at the time and been nowhere near the Basil home. Some member of Susan Basil's family believed that Stano killed her, while others do not accept that he had done it. However, her older brother has stated in interviews that whether he did it or not, Stano did deserve to die for the murders he actually did commit. And that's the point that we're at in this case. How many murders did Gerald Stano actually commit? He was convicted of 9 murders and received 8 life sentences and 1 death sentence, which was carried out on March 23, 1998 in the Florida State Prison via electric chair. But as I talked about earlier in the episode, Stano did retract a lot of his statements, so much so that he said he had actually not killed anybody and that the state police were simply trying to clear their books of murders and had used him as a patsy, much as police in Texas had done with Henry Lee Lucas. However, a lot of the crimes that Stano confessed to, he had intimate details of that were not fed to him, and this has been proven. Even those who say that Stano was coerced into confessing have said that he did in fact kill many of the women he was convicted of. They have also stated they believe he killed around 22 women. Now, how did all of this come out? Well, in 1985, a number of law enforcement officers swore an affidavit stating they had seen Detective Paul Crow feeding Stano information about cases to which he later confessed. Nothing really ever came of this. At the time of Stano's execution, he did release a letter through his lawyer stating that he was innocent of all the murders, and that he felt for the loved ones. He blamed his confessions on Paul Crow. We're going to get back to that in a moment. As for Paul Crow, in 1997, he was relieved of his post as chief of police after being embroiled in a scandal involving fraud. As for Gerald Stano's guilt, my own personal opinion after reading the court documents that are available to the public, as well as other publications, is that he was a serial killer. Now, I can't state that he did murder all of the young women that he confessed to, but I do believe he killed a good number of them. He was too detailed and knew too many things that not even investigators knew about some of the killings, as well as stating from the start how he would place them, which was usually lying on one side, and that he would cover them with tree branches and leaves in order to hide them. Something at the time that the detectives had not connected to all of these different cases. With that being said, I'd like to invite anyone who is interested about discussing this case to the Facebook page under the Deathcast. I would love to hear your thoughts about it, to know what you think of Gerald Stano. Was he a serial killer? Was he innocent of all charges? Let me know what you think. That's the Deathcast for this week. I want to thank you all for coming with me on this trip into the morbid world of Gerald Stano. If you enjoyed this episode and liked the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or whatever it is that you get your podcasts. It really does help the show grow. Our book of the week this week is Blind Fury by Anna Flowers. There are a number of books on Gerald Stano out there. This, in my opinion, is the best one. It gets into his mind and his upbringing, as well as the lives of his victims the most. And it was really informative and a very enthralling read. So, if you can find it, I know it's out of print, but it is available used online at a reasonable price. I really suggest you check it out. Until next week, stay morbid.
Welcome to the Deathcast.